Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 horrific, once-in-a-lifetime events. These are the kinds of things you almost wouldn't believe happened if they hadn't been documented. And one of them is pure nightmare fuel, just extremely disturbing. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. At just 28 years old, Kirsty's potential as a scientist and oceanographer was just about limitless. Her resume was already decorated and lengthy, having earned a degree in geology at the University of London and a Master of Science at Southampton University before getting to work in places like Greenland and Australia. But in the summer of 2002, an opportunity presented itself that she couldn't pass up. The British Antarctic Survey, or BAS, had offered her a 30-month contract to live and work in Antarctica while studying the effects of ice movement on plant and animal life there. As you might imagine, for a scientist in her field, this was the trip of a lifetime, so she immediately accepted and got ready to head to one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. She would then travel to Rothera Research Station, which sits on the edge of Adelaide Island in Antarctica. And like most places on the continent, it's surrounded by snow, sea, and jagged mountains. As you might imagine as well, life there is unlike anywhere else, as was the work, which again was exactly what she was there for. On July 22, 2003, she and a colleague, Richard, were scheduled to snorkel near the shoreline, checking on the progress of underwater monitoring equipment. It was part of a routine survey, and essentially she'd be checking to see how much the ice had moved since the last survey. The waters that day were calm and glassy, and the weather was clear and cold as Kirsty put on her bright orange dry suit in preparation for the dive. It was just after 3:10 p.m. when Kirsty and Richard entered the water to begin checking on their ice tracking equipment. And although they were working as a team, they each had their own responsibilities, so almost immediately they split apart and began their work about 50 feet or 15 meters away from one another. As Richard began to locate his ice tracking equipment, all of a sudden he heard a muted underwater shriek. He then whipped around toward where the sound came from in just enough time to see Kirsty disappear into the dark water as if something was pulling at her feet. He then darted toward Kirsty as fast as he could before realizing there was suddenly no trace of her at all. All he could do was stare down into the blackness below, wondering what had just happened. Then, just as quickly, he surfaced and started swimming toward the 2-person shore team that was assisting them. He would then learn that as they watched from land, they said they briefly saw what looked like a struggle in the water between Kirsty and a leopard seal before she was pulled beneath the surface. At 3:25 p.m., a mayday call went out and a rescue team mobilized fast. A boat was then launched, but when it reached the area where Kirsty was last seen, she was still missing. The water around them was also just as empty and still as it was when the dive began, almost eerily so after what had happened moments earlier. But either way, Kirsty's teammates continued to scour the surrounding ocean for any sign of her, but the silence remained for another 10 minutes until something finally broke the water a little less than a mile away. When one of the team members spotted it, the sight was beyond horrific. It was in fact a leopard seal, and it had Kirsty's body face down in the water and her head firmly in its mouth. The boat then raced toward the seal as one of the rescuers started hitting the water with a shovel, hoping to scare the seal away from her. As they closed in, the seal got spooked by the nearing boat and released Kirsty, but it actually stayed nearby, circling the boat as rescuers worked to get her on board. Emergency first aid was then given, but despite their best efforts, Kirsty was still unresponsive. The boat then raced back to shore, and Kirsty was transported to Rothera's medical station, where the base doctor took over and tried everything to bring her back. For more than an hour, he tried to resuscitate her, but nothing worked. At that point, it became clear there was nothing more that could be done, and she was pronounced dead. The news of her passing hit her 21 colleagues hard, both because of how sudden and violent the event was and how much Kirsty was adored by those she worked with. Back in the United Kingdom, her family was then notified the next morning of what happened. And Kirsty's death was a first, not just for the British Antarctic Survey, but in the recorded history of human interaction with leopard seals. No human being before had ever been killed by one, and it was the first death in the survey's long history. And it was later determined that she had been held underwater by the seal for 6 excruciating minutes and dragged to a depth of around 230 feet or 70 meters. The official report also later documented 45 separate injuries, most of which were around her head and neck because the seal's grip on Kirsty's body had been relentless. And for even more context, leopard seals aren't like the ones you imagine balancing beach balls in the zoo. These animals are apex predators. They're fast, strong, and fitted with jaws that can crush bone. In Antarctica, they sit near the top of the food chain, just below orcas, which are their only documented predator. Most of the time, they hunt penguins or smaller seals, and they do so with brutal efficiency. When a leopard seal targets a penguin, it grabs it by the feet, thrashes it around, and actually smashes it against the surface of the water until it passes. And even in freezing conditions, the leopard seal is surprisingly agile for its size. An adult seal can grow to more than 11 feet or 3.4 meters long, and some have even been documented at an astounding 1,300 pounds. This is roughly the size of a walrus. And according to the rescue team that saw the seal that attacked Kirsty, it was unusually large, maybe about 15 feet or 4.5 meters long. It's also believed that it was a female because they're known to be about 50% larger than their male counterparts. Leopard seals also have sharp incisor teeth and inch-long canines designed for tearing flesh, even though their preferred method of killing is by bashing their prey against the water. Their heads are also shaped in almost a reptilian fashion with long jaws and piercing eyes, and they don't scare easily. In fact, they've been known to approach humans out of curiosity, but despite this, attacks on people are extremely rare. Leopard seals don't usually go after humans unless provoked or unless they mistake them for prey. In the official report released in the weeks following Kirsty's death, an expert on leopard seals suggests that Kirsty may have looked like a fur seal from the leopard seal's perspective as she moved through the water in her snorkel gear. Some experts speculated that the animal may have acted out of confusion or defense. The report also emphasized that no leopard seals have been spotted in the area before the dive, which is something that divers are trained to look out for. Standard procedure was to cancel any underwater activity if a leopard seal was seen nearby, and for 30 years, that policy had kept everyone safe. This time though, obviously, it wasn't enough. The animal had remained hidden beneath the surface, unseen until the moment it struck. It hadn't given anyone a chance to react, and it didn't circle or approach the way curious seals sometimes do. It attacked fast and then dragged Kirsty into the deep, then strangely stayed in the area after letting her go. And so, this was a 1 in a million kind of event. Kirsty had followed the rules and done everything right, and still none of it mattered. In response, the research community began reevaluating safety protocols, not just at Rothera but across other programs operating in the Antarctic. Obviously, no one wanted to lose another scientist, but in the end, it was determined that no amount of caution or procedure could have changed the outcome that day in 2003. Born in 1985 in Penzance, England, Jacob was the youngest of 4 kids. His older sister Grace was 3 years older than him, but some accounts make them sound more like twins in some ways and opposites in others. Jacob wanted to do what he wanted to do, while Grace was the star student of nearly every class she was in. Jacob, meanwhile, was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age of 10 and took to skipping classes so he could hitchhike down to the beach with his friends to go surfing. He'd actually learned to swim around the same time he could walk and seemed to be even more comfortable in the ocean than he was on land. And eventually, Jacob dropped out of school, but not with the intention of doing nothing. He had dreams of his own in mind. He wanted to be a photographer, a real artist people would know the name of. As he began working on that career path in the summer of 2001, Grace was working at a children's camp in France when she began developing persistent headaches. She would then end up coming home in August, and by the next month, she was officially diagnosed with a brain tumor. The family was sure she'd make a recovery since it had been caught so soon after symptoms presented, but 6 months later, Grace's cancer was back, and this time she needed surgery in Belgium to try to remove the second, stronger tumor. Tragically, on the 18th of December 2002, Grace passed away at only 20 years old. Before she passed away, she asked for her ashes to be kept until another member of the family also passed so that she wouldn't be alone when she was spread into the sea. Of all the things in Jacob's life, this seemed to be the defining moment. He'd lost his sister and his best friend, and in the words of his family, he'd seen how she'd done nothing to deserve her fate. But rather than being angry about it, Grace's life lit a fire under Jacob. He decided that he was going to give his all to everything he did from then on, doing all the things he had dreamed of and living a life that was worthy of 2 people. And unlike most people who make grand statements when they're caught up in the moment, he actually did exactly that. He would then go on to win awards for his photography, including National Geographic's Adventure Photographer Award. His work was featured on billboards in the West End of London, it printed on surf magazines, and known as far away as Australia. To add to that, he also took every other hobby he had just as seriously. He trained in the water every chance he could get, practiced holding his breath for minutes at a time, climbed mountains as well as caves, and traveled the world to do it. And to say Jacob was a skilled swimmer would be an incredible understatement. He was the type of person who actually taught skilled swimmers how to do things safely. Part of a YouTube channel he ran under the name Whirlpool Hitman included instructions on how to safely interact with natural whirlpools and swim in rough waters. Others, meanwhile, show he still took a somewhat lighthearted or side interest in YouTube. He had cat videos, memes, and the occasional piece of clickbait, but his most popular video sits at over 40 million views. So while it was clear he was a consummate professional, his channel also seemed to be a bit of an outlet to be silly or to be a little edgy. And one day that took him to Hale Harbour. Just to the northeast of Penzance, on the other side of the peninsula, Hale was one of the first industrial ports in all the UK and hosted steam-powered metal foundries from the 1700s onward. One such foundry, actually just called Foundry, was established in 1779 and built a harbour of their own to keep up with the local competition. The result was Carnsue Pool, which is a calm artificial harbour inside the natural bay, about 590 by 230 meters. Its water depth also fluctuates between under half a meter and about 3 meters deep with the tide twice daily. There was also a bridge that spanned over the entrance to the harbour with a small set of canal gates underneath them. But tidal water actually flowed in and out through a pair of stone brick tunnels underneath the earthwork dike. And because of this construction, for just a few days of the year in spring, the change in tide heights with the season turned those pipes into something else entirely. A whirlpool, a couple of times larger than a person, would form at the mouth as the tide came in faster than it could fit through the pipes. And on the 28th of May, 2013, Jacob couldn't miss the opportunity. That day was the strongest tide of the entire year. Stopping by the house of a local friend of his, 7-year-old David, Jacob asked him to help with some filming and made his way down to the harbour. Once there, he set to work inspecting the whirlpool. He then put on a neoprene diving suit to give himself extra buoyancy and then spent a good 20 minutes acclimatizing to the whirlpool. He kept his distance, then gradually figured out the boundaries, the strength, and spent enough time with it that the whirlpool began to weaken with the tide as he waited for David to arrive. In the meantime as well, Jacob got some of his filming done wearing a rubber horse mask in true 2013 fashion, during which he also captured a few interior views of the whirlpool with a GoPro attached to a pole. When David arrived shortly after, Jacob explained the whirlpool to him and his confidence in managing it. And again, it wasn't like he was just some carefree surfer dude. He'd been through dozens of whirlpools before and could teach others how to do so and how to prepare for them. He just needed someone else to hold the camera while he was in there to get some shots that would otherwise be difficult. After those were shot, the last thing that needed doing was just some underwater video by hand to show the vortex with a human scale to it, and Jacob cheerfully took the camera before diving under the water to do that. Now, neoprene foam wetsuits contain thousands of little air bubbles trapped inside them, which help insulate the diver, but just like the human body, they also compress as you go deeper. Just from traveling a few meters below the surface, as much as a quarter of the suit's buoyancy is lost. Closer to 10 meters and the full half of it is gone. We don't know exactly what went wrong, but all he would have needed to do was accidentally go a couple of meters deeper than he'd meant to find himself suddenly overwhelmed. If the whirlpool managed to grab him just a little bit deeper, then it would only get harder as what buoyancy remained vanished. Jacob was quite capable of holding his breath for minutes at a time, but considering the rough nature of the 5-meter pipe he was sucked into, there would have been ample opportunity for him to hit his head, chest, or jaw and suddenly inhale water. And per a geological survey of the pool, the maximum possible flow rate was a terrifying 15.5 cubic meters of water per second, or over 15,000 liters. That's enough to fill a 2.5 million liter Olympic swimming pool in under 3 minutes. If he had become momentarily stuck in the pipe, disoriented, or simply caught off guard, we'll never know. Whatever the case, Jacob didn't resurface when he was supposed to, and as David began looking for him, a fisherman in the pool came over to assist. Jacob then did resurface face down and unconscious as the two men called 999. A lifeboat crew then arrived shortly after, and Jacob was airlifted to the hospital but was pronounced dead upon his arrival. The coroner's inquest would later confirm that he had drowned. Originally, Grace's ashes were to be scattered with their grandmother's on Gwynver Beach, which is an off-the-beaten-path place about 13 kilometers from Penzance, where the cross on the local church is made from 2 surfboards. Tragically, the ceremony had been scheduled for the 29th of May, the day after Jacob would pass away, so in the end, they would go together. On February 9, 2001, within the control room of the nuclear submarine, the USS Greenville, Captain Scott had an important mission that day. The US Navy had developed what it called the Distinguished Visitor Embarkation, or DVE program. This was a public relations campaign that invited civilians, journalists, and even members of Congress to essentially go for a joyride on a nuclear submarine. And in simpler terms, it was a chance for the Navy to show off its capabilities and justify the need for these marine vessels. By 2001, this was now routine for Scott, who had led several DVE missions before, and compared to an average day of training missions, these special rides were much more loose and casual. Typically, these DVE missions included maneuvers crewmen could do in their sleep but were meant to impress the untrained. So Scott viewed the DVE events as a chance to meet with business and political elites, and for the February 9th mission, he'd be entertaining 16 distinguished visitors. Early that morning, the Greenville loaded up with its crew of 106 plus its 16 guests, and the ship departed Pearl Harbor at 7:57 a.m. in conditions that were pretty close to perfect. As the trip got underway, spirits were high inside the Greenville, and after nearly 2.5 hours of traveling along the surface, it reached its dive site south of Oahu slightly later than scheduled. The sub then slipped underneath the waves at around 10:17 a.m. and descended to a depth of 150 feet or 46 meters. During this time, guests were allowed to sit at control stations under Scott's supervision, and he always got a kick out of seeing how impressed visitors were with the inner workings of the submarine. Shortly afterward, the visitors were split into two groups. One group would go to lunch and the other would remain behind in the control room. After an hour, they were scheduled to switch places, with lunch service expected to end around 12:30. This was when the real show was set to begin, but lunch ran long because Scott was apparently caught up in conversation with the distinguished visitors. In fact, he apparently had to be reminded several times after 12:30 that they might return to port late if he didn't get the maneuvers underway soon. This meant that it wasn't until 1:10 that afternoon that Scott returned to the control room and everyone prepared for what would be an exciting demonstration of what the Greenville could really do. As the captain readied the crew and the ship, fire control technician Patrick watched sonar contacts from his position. He was responsible for keeping an eye on any other civilian or military vessels that might be in the vicinity, and if the Greenville was getting too close to any. During this time, Patrick identified 3 surface vessels in the area and assigned them contacts S-12, S-13, and S-14, but none of them were any closer than 7 nautical miles or 13 kilometers away. So he would end up giving the go-ahead from his perspective for the maneuvers to begin. At around 1:15 p.m., the Greenville finally commenced with a series of high-speed turns, twists, and ups and downs. And of course, all of this would lead up to what would be a grand finale, a maneuver known as Emergency Deep. This is when the Greenville would descend to a depth of 400 feet or 120 meters, and then ascend within seconds by blowing the ballast tanks and sending the submarine skyrocketing toward the surface. The almost 7,000-ton ship would then quite literally leap out of the water like a whale, and once complete, the crew would guide the ship back to port in Pearl Harbor to end the day. As you might imagine though, this maneuver requires preparation, not the least of which included ensuring there are no surface vessels that could be affected by such a rapid and violent ascent. As Scott looked through the periscope, Patrick checked on his sonar contacts, but he couldn't quite get a read on where the S-14 was heading, so that particular vessel took his attention for an extra moment. Once he felt confident the S-14 was a safe distance away, he noticed that the S-13 appeared to be heading right for the Greenville's location. But just as he was doing this, he heard Scott announce that he had made no visual contact with any nearby surface vessels. So, figuring that Scott would have seen the S-13 through the periscope, Patrick just assumed his sonar contacts were wrong and gave the okay from his station for the maneuver to proceed. Scott then ordered the ship to descend to its target depth of 400 feet, and once there, he invited 2 of the visitors to the controls for the ballast tank blow. At 1:43 p.m., the captain gave the order to blow the tanks, which sent the ship screaming through the water column toward the surface and directly into complete disaster. What Scott and Patrick had both overlooked and misjudged was the location of S-13, which was a Japanese fishing trawler named the Ahim Maru. The 191-foot or 58-meter ship carried a total of 35 people, including 13 high school students who were planning on future careers as fishermen. As it turned out, the Ahim Maru wasn't 8 nautical miles from the Greenville like Patrick believed, despite a sonar screen saying otherwise. The trawler was instead on a collision course with the rapidly ascending submarine, and just as the nose of the Greenville breached the surface, it did so right next to the fishing trawler. A moment later, the submarine leveled off, sending its reinforced rudder directly into the fishing trawler, slicing it nearly in half. Scott then watched in horror through the periscope as the boat rose skyward before literally sinking into the ocean within minutes. Those aboard the ship who could get off were left scrambling for life rafts or any floating wreckage. Shortly after the impact, the Greenville radioed to Pearl Harbor for help, and the U.S. Coast Guard sprang into action. At first, Scott started to prepare his crew to take on any survivors the Greenville could rescue, but the seas proved to be too rough to open the main deck hatches. And not only that, but the massive submarine was making the waves of the crash site worse due to the amount of water the ship was displacing, so he had to make the difficult decision to move the Greenville away from the survivors, fearing the sub could capsize the life rafts. Sometime later, the Coast Guard would be able to rescue 26 of the 35, but the other 9 were lost to sea, including 4 17-year-old high school students and 2 teachers, making the collision the deadliest between a nuclear submarine and a civilian vessel in U.S. history. Following the disaster, the U.S. Navy convened a court of inquiry to investigate what led up to the collision and how this could have happened, and their findings were damning for Scott in particular. The first sign of trouble cropped up before the Greenville ever left Pearl Harbor, as the ship's analog video signal display unit was determined to be broken. This system displays sonar information, but rather than delay or outright cancel the trip, Scott determined that this was not a mission-critical piece of equipment. Had the system been operable, it's more than likely Scott would have seen the sonar contact of the approaching Ahim Maru before giving the orders to blow the ballast tanks and initiating the rapid ascent of the submarine. And second, despite DVE missions being relatively more laid back than standard training missions, it did have a schedule to abide by. And even though the Greenville departed on time, the schedule slowly started to slip away from the commander as he divided his attention in too many places. By the time maneuvers began at 1:15 p.m., the Greenville was already 46 minutes behind schedule. This threatened to shorten the most important part of the whole program. And not wanting to sacrifice any of the maneuvers for the sake of making up time, Scott apparently rushed through protocol and cut corners. Like, for example, at the conclusion of the high-speed maneuvers, standard procedure called for the ship to maintain a steady course for 3 minutes to ensure the sonar contact was reestablished and accurate. This apparently only occurred for 90 seconds before Scott ordered the submarine up to the periscope depth to perform his visual contact duties, which also inadvertently didn't give Patrick enough time to confirm the sonar data he was receiving. And then beyond that, Scott was supposed to perform a 360-degree look around the ship with the periscope for at least 3 additional minutes before ordering the sub to emergency depth. But apparently instead, Scott only checked areas where there were known to be surface vessels before the maneuver started. And by that point, the information was outdated. In 2021, as the 20th anniversary of the disaster neared, Scott wrote an 8-page open letter to the Ahim Maru families, apologizing again and taking full and sole responsibility for what happened. The U.S. Navy continues to operate its DVE program, and no further incidents have occurred since 2001. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.